Hi, this is your horoscope for Scorpio and Scorpio rising for February of 2019. My name is Chris Brennan. I'm an astrologer from Denver, Colorado, and we're going to be looking at your transits for the next few weeks. So this is a bit of an experiment where I'm doing a live stream simultaneously on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter at the same time in order to do all the horoscopes for February. So far so good. This is number 8, so let's jump right into it. All right, so first things first, here's the ingress chart that shows the dates that different planets will move into different signs over the course of the month. It also shows the 2 lunations, which is the new moon in Aquarius on the 4th and the full moon in Virgo on the 19th. The other thing I have is the planetary movements calendar for February, which shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the month and how far they'll get through the signs by the end of the month. This is kind of useful for showing how fast different planets move through different signs, as well as which houses are going to get activated in your chart over the course of the next month. But the main chart that we're going to look at is the Solar Fire Animate chart feature, which shows the exact positions of the planets on different days of the month. So one of the things that I said on the other horoscopes is that there's not a lot of major outer planet activity this month in terms of planetary stations like retrogrades or directs, or planets changing signs in terms of outer planets. There will be next month when Uranus goes into Taurus. That's a major outer planet change. But for February, we're going to focus mainly on inner planet transits, since there are a few inner planets that will change signs this month and make exact aspects to other planets. So let's jump right into those. So what do we have going on here? So first things first, there is the Mars transit, which is an easy one to focus on because that kind of divides February into 2 parts. So in the first half of February, we have Mars finishing up its transit through Aries. So it starts off the month at 21 degrees of Aries in your 6th house of work and health. And eventually, by the middle of February, Mars completes its transit through Aries and it moves into Taurus, which is your 7th house of relationships and partnership. So that easily then divides the month into 2 halves. And last month when I did the horoscopes for January, which you can find on my YouTube channel, which is called The Astrology School at youtube.com/theastrologyschool, I talked a lot with Cam White about Mars transiting through Aries, which is, for those of you with Scorpio rising, your 6th house of work and health. So for some of you, it could be, this would have coincided with a month of putting much greater emphasis and energy into your work so that you had to really push yourself in order to get a project done, or in order to just expend extra energy at work in order to accomplish some things that you had to accomplish. And that can ultimately be constructive and fine, even though it requires an additional expenditure of energy compared to normal. But other times that expenditure of energy can manifest more as like irritation or sometimes strife or conflict in the workplace. For other people, it can be like a separation of the workplace or having to leave one's job for some reason. So it really depends on your individual natal chart, whether that's going to manifest more constructively or more challengingly. I tend to think that generally speaking, people with day charts would probably have a little bit more challenges with that transit, whereas people with night charts, it might be a little bit more constructive, but it depends on what planets are in your 6th house or aspecting your 6th house natally, as well as whether Mars is activated as a Time Lord this year through techniques like annual profections. So the first half of the month has to do with some of that workplace stuff, so definitely be more careful in the workplace, especially around February 13th, February 14th. There's an exact conjunction of Mars and Uranus in your 6th house, which can sometimes be, Mars-Uranus conjunctions can tend to be kind of explosive or kind of like unexpected sudden disruptions. So be careful, if you can be, not to do something impetuous that could, or sort of brash, that could put you in a difficult situation, either in terms of your workplace or in terms of health matters, since the 6th house also has to do with health. So obviously a Mars transit can have a constructive manifestation when it has to do with health, about like working out or putting greater energy into improving your body or your physical physique in some sense. and just focusing on health and dietary or other types of matters like that can be a great manifestation of Mars going through the sixth house. But you just want to be a little bit extra cautious there because of some of the potential for either conflict at work or conflict when it comes to health matters, especially around the time of that Mars-Uranus conjunction around the 13th. So after that point, in the second half of the month, we see that Mars ingresses into Taurus and moves into your seventh house of relationships, where it's going to spend not just the rest of February, but also most of March moving through that sign and moving through that house in your chart. So the seventh house has to do with relationships and partnerships. It's kind of the same spiel as before in terms of the potential for Mars transits, which is always a greater expenditure of energy in that part of your life, and sometimes having to put more focus towards it, and sometimes having stress as a result of that the most constructive manifestations. But sometimes the downside can be irritability or strife or conflict in that part of your life as well. So definitely be from the 14th forward more careful about the potential for conflict with like a partner, whether that's a business partner or a romantic partner, like a relationship, like a marriage or something like that. Either you could be more irritable and prone towards strife with a partner, or your partner could be more irritable and prone towards getting in conflicts with you. It might be a good idea more than normal to sort of hold yourself back or to moderate yourself if you do get into some sort of conflict with somebody, if you're not looking for a more long-term or significant conflict or separation, just because sometimes when Mars is transiting sort of important sectors of our chart, we can end up initiating what seem like minor fights or minor squabbles with somebody that later turn out to be much more significant or have much more long-term impacts if we end up doing or saying something that we don't intend to do in the heat of the moment, or that we wouldn't have done, some other time if we were in a more cool frame of mind. So just be careful, in terms of that, in terms of partnerships this month. There's plenty of potential for doing positive, constructive things with a partner, or putting greater energy into working on your relationships in a constructive fashion. And I think especially for people with night charts, you're going to tend to see the more constructive manifestations of that transit, but there's a little bit more of a potential for some of the more challenging things to manifest, especially for those of you with day charts. So just do what you can to moderate that. It looks like we have some people in the chat. So thanks everybody for joining us from Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. This is a live stream. So if you guys, especially those of you with Scorpio rising, have any questions during the course of this, please be sure to let me know in the comments section and I'll try to answer them if I can. All right, so back to the transits and the transit chart. So Mars is one of the major interplanet transits this month. The other major one is Venus, where Venus starts out the month at the beginning of February in the later degrees of Sagittarius. So Venus is just coming off of that conjunction with Jupiter, which went exact around the mid to late parts of January, which we were actually able to see in the night sky, in the early morning sky, when Venus and Jupiter were conjoining as these two bright stars in the sky. So Venus is coming off of that, and pretty quickly in early February, by February 3rd or February 4th, Venus departs from Sagittarius and moves out of your second house of finances, which we talked about last month in the horoscopes for January, and it moves into your third house, which is the house that has to do with communication, short distance travel. Sometimes it has to do with lower forms of education, siblings, relatives, like extended family and relatives like that, your neighbors and your neighborhood and your city in general, or your immediate surroundings and environment. So Venus is moving into that sector of your chart, and this is actually a positive transit for all of those topics that should, it's one of the things I'm really looking forward to about February, and it's one of the ways that February kind of stands out in terms of this overall year, because we have this nice Venus transit that February opens with pretty early in the month, and Venus leaves that sign right at the very end of February or the beginning of March. So it's really, this transit is very much characterizing February in most of its entirety. So one of the reasons I like this transit a lot is that you actually have some pretty major long-term, somewhat challenging transits going through this sector of your chart, largely not just due to Pluto transiting through Capricorn, which is a very long-term transit, but especially over the past year, you've had Saturn going through Capricorn and going through your third house, where it's sort of raising some issues or obstacles or challenges that have to do with like challenges with siblings or challenges and setbacks with communication, or restrictions in travel, restrictions in speaking, and other third house topics like that. So Saturn transits can be very heavy and they can be very restrictive, whereas Venus is kind of the opposite, and its entry into Capricorn is going to sort of give you a temporary vacation in some sense, where it may, for some of you, present a sort of solution or an opportunity to reconcile some of the issues that Saturn has been bringing up for you as it's been transiting through this house over the course of the past year or so, since December of 2017. So this really peaks or culminates around February 18th, when there's an exact Venus-Saturn conjunction at 16 degrees of Capricorn, where the sort of potential of Venus's mitigating power over Saturn really peaks and really hits its high point at the time of that conjunction. Eventually, a few days later, Venus conjoins Pluto at 22 on February 22nd or 23rd, around 22 Capricorn, and then eventually Venus squares Uranus from 29 Capricorn to 29 Aries at the very end of February and beginning of March. So what I would say is, just if you've been experiencing any challenges in this area of your life or area of your chart over the course of the past year, then February is a good time to think about creative solutions and perhaps asking somebody or bringing in another party in order to help you find some creative solutions in this area of your life. Whatever third house topics you've been wrestling with over the course of the past year as Saturn's been moving through that sector of your chart, whether it be issues with, for example, siblings. I've seen some people who had a falling out with siblings that roughly coincided with Saturn moving into their third house, since siblings is one of the primary indications, or one of the primary people in our life that's indicated by the third house. So Venus moving through that sign or catching up to Saturn could be a good opportunity to attempt some sort of reconciliation if you've just like completely fallen out with siblings, and if that's something that you want to do, is be on better terms with them. Other people have run into issues with travel or communication, and so this month might be a good time to get your car fixed if that's been a major issue for you over the course of the past few months with Saturn's transit through that sign. If that's limited your mobility, for example, or if there's something else that's limiting your mobility, then Venus transiting through the third can be a good time to attempt to rectify and resolve that situation, whatever it is. So that's one of my favorite transits this month, just because it's sort of dealing with, and it's tied into a long-term transit, which is Saturn over the course of 3 years going through that house or that sector of your chart, your third whole sign house, but it's giving this nice counterbalance over the course of a month that isn't something that you get very frequently. So that's going to be more the case. It's going to be more positive for those of you with night charts, and it's going to be a little bit more muted or somewhat less positive for those of you with day charts, but nonetheless it should be a relatively helpful counterbalancing transit to have pretty much either way. And I'm just checking to see if there's any comments. One person asked if I'll have Cam White back on the show. Yeah, definitely. I would love to have Cam White back on. He just posted his horoscopes for this month, I think a few days ago. So you should check out his YouTube channel, which is White Light Astrology. And he's got some great advice in those horoscopes for January. And hopefully I'll have him over again. It's kind of late here, and that's one of the reasons I'm doing a solo show tonight. Lisa joined me for the horoscope for Gemini, but since it's like 12:30 at night here, I'm pretty much on my own in terms of doing horoscopes this month for all of you guys with Scorpio and Scorpio rising. Thank you. One guy on YouTube says he's proud of me for pushing through these streams. I appreciate you. You're welcome. I don't know how far I'm going to get because it's pretty late tonight, and I may or may not take a break after this and resume tomorrow. Austin and Kelly and I are actually recording the monthly forecast for February for the Astrology Podcast tomorrow at 1 o'clock p.m. So I've actually got to wake up tomorrow and get ready for that before too long. So I'm trying to figure out how far I can push this tonight. All right, so that's good for comments. Let me just see what other things I meant to cover here in terms of the transits of this month. So we talked about the Mars transit moving from your 6th into your 7th. We talked about the Venus transit through your 3rd. The other thing we have to touch on, of course, is the 2 lunations, which I don't think I've mentioned yet this month. So there's a new moon that's taking place in Aquarius in your 4th house, and the 4th house has to do with your home, your family, your private life, and your parents. So a new moon is a new beginning or a fresh start, or sometimes laying the seeds or the foundation of something that will grow and develop over the course of the next 6 months. So that new moon takes place, it looks like on the 4th of February. So this could be a new development for you in terms of your home and living situation. So sometimes people, you guys have been having eclipses in your 4th and 7th houses for the past couple of years. And those have likely coincided, especially for some of you, with some pretty major or more notable shifts and changes in terms of home versus career, 4th house versus 10th house over the course of the past couple of years. And that just came to an end recently with the final lunar eclipse in Leo of that sequence. So this is just like a normal and seemingly almost like minor lunation in your 4th house in Aquarius compared to all of those eclipses. So I definitely don't want to overhype this, because in comparison to the eclipses, it's probably going to be a much less significant new beginning than some of those others have been over the course of the past 2 years. But nonetheless, it can still represent a new phase or a shift in terms of your home and living situation, or something about your relationship with your parents that could be notable and will initially start to develop slowly and somewhat imperceptibly, but then eventually over the course of the next 6 months, it grows and develops and then turns into something that's much more noticeable in your life that you may not have picked up on at first when it started in February. So just pay attention to any developments this month in terms of your home or living situation, or in terms of your relationship with your parents, because it could become more significant 6 months from now, basically. All right, aside from that, so that's the first lunation of the month. The second lunation of the month is a full moon, which is in Virgo on the 19th of February. So Virgo, of course, for those of you with Scorpio rising, is your 11th house of friends, groups, and alliances. And a full moon represents a culmination of events or something coming to maturity that you initiated in that sphere of your life 6 months earlier. So this is like 6 months ago, you may have started something in terms of, let's say, making a new friend, or starting to get involved in a new group of people or a new alliance of some sort. And what's happening now this month towards the later part of February is that with this full moon taking place in Virgo, that's finally what you initiated at that time 6 months ago with friends and groups is starting to bear fruit at this time. So if that was a positive development in your life and you like where that's going, then basically just keep doing what you're doing, and you'll see it continue to grow and develop and become a more permanent fixture in your life in the future. Whereas if the development that you see that started 6 months ago, and if it becomes more clear at this time, but it turns out that it's not a very positive development, or it's something that you don't necessarily like in your life, then this would be a really crucial moment to sort of change your trajectory and start pushing that in a different direction. If you would like to go in a different direction in terms of that development with your friends and the groups that you're involved in, just because if you don't, then you could sort of like bake it into your life as a more permanent fixture in the long term. Whereas at this point, once it's sort of coming to light at the full moon, there's an option and there's a choice that you have to make in terms of what direction you want to go, and if you want to make this a permanent thing and confirm it, or whether you want to make a sort of slight course correction for the future. So that's the second lunation that's taking place this month. Let's see, other major things that I meant to mention. The only other major inner planet transit that I meant to mention is that we are coming up on a Mercury retrograde, and that's going to take place in March. So I don't want to get too ahead of myself in talking too much about things that I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about next month. But I did want to mention it because in the second half of February, Mercury enters its shadow, which is the degrees that it will later retrograde back to once it goes retrograde in March. So we see that Mercury stations retrograde at 29 degrees of Pisces in early March, and then it retrogrades all the way back to about 16 degrees of Pisces, where it conjoins Neptune a second time by the end of March. So that's relevant now in February because that means as soon as it hits about 15, 16 degrees of Pisces, Mercury is sort of queuing up or setting up a sequence of events that will play out over the course of several weeks once it goes retrograde. So I only mention this because you should probably pay attention to it if it starts setting up a sequence, or if you have a notable event that takes place around the time of the Mercury-Neptune conjunction around February 19th, then even if that seems like a minor or like a one-time event at the time, it may turn out that there's something about that event that isn't finished and that comes back into your life a few weeks later when Mercury retrogrades and returns back to those degrees especially in March and a little bit in April. So pay attention to that. One of the things I'm telling everybody generally is to be careful about communication and miscommunication, because a Mercury retrograde sometimes comes with that in general, but that's especially heightened when Mercury is also conjunct Neptune while being retrograde. Since this is happening in your fifth house, and the fifth house is the place of creativities and creative affairs, it could be actually something that you could use quite constructively for being creative and for artistic matters at this time, around the time of the Mercury-Neptune conjunction, especially around February 19th. And that's one of the more constructive spins that I would put on it. But nonetheless, still just be careful to be as clear in communication as you can. If anything you're doing involves that, just because the tendency will be for the opposite of that to happen around that time. All right, and I think those are the main things that I meant to mention. Do you guys have any questions for me? Any of those of you, especially with Scorpio rising, have any questions before I wrap this up for the horoscope for February? And by the way, I meant to mention that I love the Scorpios for some reason. I've been trying to figure out why my horoscopes for Scorpios tend to get the most views. And I've been trying to figure out if that's because Scorpios are like innately drawn to me more because I have a Scorpio stellium, or if it's because I'm like subconsciously giving the Scorpios better delineations than I'm giving the other signs, and therefore almost like playing to the crowd. I'm not sure what the answer to that is, but I'm still trying to figure out. If you guys have any ideas, let me know. Let's see, questions in the chat. Thanks everybody. It looks like there's a lot of people watching. Somebody says that they're a Virgo sun and a Leo ascendant and a Cancer something, and I'd like to know which reading is for me. If you have a Leo ascendant, then you want to look at the reading for Leo for February, which I did a little bit earlier tonight. Somebody asked if they missed Cancer. I did Cancer earlier tonight as well, so just check Twitter, my page on Twitter at Chris Brennan 7, or YouTube at The Astrology School to see that. All right, and I guess that's it. All right, guys. Well, thanks a lot for watching. I think I covered all of the transits I meant to cover. I'll be back again next month to talk about some of the major outer planet stuff that's coming up, like especially that Uranus ingress, which is coming up to Taurus here in March, which is going to be a major thing. We talked about that way back when I started doing horoscopes in June or July, but that's going to be a major one to discuss for March, but I will save that for next time. So I hope you guys have a great month in February. Thanks a lot for watching. Be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel if you want to see more live streams or astrology videos or horoscopes like this one in the future. You can find that at youtube.com/theastrologyschool. Otherwise, thanks a lot for watching. Good luck. I'll see you again next month for the horoscopes for March. So until then, signing off. Have a good month.